Consulting firms also have private clients with their own interests. And there's always going to be a danger that a consulting firm that's asked to advise the government ends up giving advice that favours their energy clients or their tax-paying clients as well. So there's real concerns there that aren't present when that work's given to a public servant who's actually going to have to be there to implement the changes that they recommend.
Yeah.
And one for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and listeners might not know that the Australian government spends about $1 billion or more each year on consulting firms, sometimes to complete necessary work and often involving confidential information. But recent scandals have racked the consulting industry, exposing some dodgy dealings by some major consulting firms.
The scandal surrounding the global consulting firm PwC is deepening by the day.
Accounting firm PwC is under fire for leaking confidential tax secrets from the government to companies like Apple and Google.
Australian taxpayers' information was stolen from the ATO and effectively monetised for profit by PwC.
PwC is one of the world's biggest advisory firms. It's a big name in tax advice, especially for lucrative multinationals.
Information from talks with the Department of Treasury about upcoming changes to Australia's tax system to help its multinational clients avoid tax.
To earn $2.5 million in fees from 14 clients to sidestep new multinational tax avoidance laws.
It was confidential, it was secret. They were briefing their clients, their big corporate companies, how to get around these laws before they were actually made.
Absolutely ropeable. This is a shocking breach of trust.
By the behaviour of PwC, it has compromised our ability to work with third parties.
It also undermines people's faith in our democracy.
The over-reliance on consulting firms has huge costs. Not only is the government, and therefore the taxpayer, spending huge amounts of money, but it also weakens our public service and, in worst cases, weakens our democracy and leads to the government making poorer decisions. To explain how all this works and more, I'm talking to the head of our Democracy and Accountability Program, Bill Brown. G'day, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
Bill, let's start off, first of all, exactly how much are we spending on consulting firms every year?
As you say, it's about $1 billion. The amount of new contracts entered into last year actually reached $2 billion. We can't say that that's a figure for a particular year because they were contracting for work out in a range of time.
Yeah.
But you can safely say it's more than $1 billion, which works out to a pretty substantial share of all the government work that's going on.
Yeah, so it's not small.
It's definitely not small.
And why does the government typically use consulting firms? Isn't this exactly what we have a public service for?
You'd think so. Part of it is that they've been operating under a cap on the number of public servants that they're meant to hire. This cap brought in by the coalition government is meant to limit the growth of government. But instead what it does is limits one supply of labour, public servants, forcing them to go to outside labour hire, consultants, contractors, and so on. So partly they've created a rod for their own backs here. But another aspect, the kind of pure model of why you might use consultants is for outside skills and experience that it's not worth retaining in-house.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine that things come up from time to time where you might need an IT professional for 6 months, but you don't want to hire them full-time.
Right.
Or you bring in an expert on the user design experience when you create your website, but you don't need that while you're continuing to operate the website. So there are reasons for going for consultants, but that doesn't explain why we have so many of them so often.
And so just tell me a little bit about why consulting firms are kind of in the media right now. There's been a couple of scandals, right?
There's been some big scandals.
The relationship between the federal government and the big four consulting firms is worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Out of the $1.38 million that it costs the taxpayer for this report,
and I can't see how $1.76 million worth of research lines up. Like, it looks dodgy.
The one that's unfolding most prominently at the moment involves PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. And almost 10 years ago now, a partner at PwC was trusted with government information about a new tax plan to crack down on multinational tax avoidance. It turns out that he spread that information around PwC, and they used that to solicit clients saying, we've got the inside scoop on what the government's going to do. Here's how you can, we assume, avoid tax.
That's pretty shocking. So essentially they had access to this confidential government information in kind of one section of the business, and then another section has kind of taken that and used it for marketing purposes to kind of rake in some more profits based on this kind of, well, essentially it's insider information, right?
Yeah, whether it meets that legal threshold kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah.
We think investigations are still ongoing. But in terms of kind of the popular understanding, they had information that they weren't supposed to use in that way, and they abused it.
And so do these kinds of conflicts of interest come up all the time? If this has happened at least one firm, PwC, how do we know it's not happening at others?
We know that other consulting firms had the mal-inoculation, as they called it. So that's the way to potentially avoid the tax reforms that were being brought in. Whether they created that through secret information or they figured out on their own, we don't know. But certainly PwC is not the only firm that's been helping clients avoid their taxes.
Yeah. So, Bill, how do we know about some of this kind of misuse of public information and breaches of confidentiality? Is this investigative reporting? Is it coming out through, I believe there's an inquiry in the Parliament at the moment? How do we know about it?
Yeah, it's really been dragged out through a number of sources, some really clever investigative reporting by the Australian Financial Review in particular. When this scandal was kind of investigated by the Tax Practitioners Board last year, it made very little splash. And it took the AFR doing the digging to turn it into what's now the subject of at least one inquiry. And actually there are multiple committees, parliamentary committees investigating this, widespread reporting. The government has gotten involved and is also asking for explanation. So it's blown up, and that's partly a testament to quality investigative journalism.
Yeah.
You know, as a government that wants to be consultative where we can, you know, this puts that sort of consultation at risk.
The government is appalled by the behaviour of PwC. It has compromised our ability to work with third parties around developing policy and legislation.
Clear case of systemic corruption and cover-up, which everyone in this place must find abhorrent.
The other thing I was going to ask is, I mean, what have the consequences been for PwC so far? Because that's a pretty huge breach of the public trust. And we know that in the past, the government has certainly prosecuted whistleblowers doing things in the public interest. What's so far happened when companies are acting for their own private interest, just for profit?
We certainly haven't seen anyone face the kind of consequences that whistleblowers face, even though, as you say, PwC was doing this for profit, not in the public interest. Peter Collins, who's the PwC partner who was trusted with the information in the first place, has lost his ability to practice for a couple of years. And as part of that, PwC committed to run conflict of interest training for its staff. You kind of hope they'd already have that, but they have to do that. More recently, because more information has come out, PwC's Australian head has resigned, or will resign in September. So there's started to be personal consequences. It's not that long ago that PwC was booked as the host of the Labor Party's budget night fundraiser, though. So it's not as if there's been swift justice.
Yeah.
But as I say, investigations are ongoing, so it's possible that more consequences for PwC will emerge.
And in our submission and publicly, the Australia Institute has been calling for some pretty specific things. What are some of the things you think need to happen now?
One of the things that the use of consultants does is it takes away from the capacity of the public service, directly by taking resources away, funds that could go to hiring public servants, but also indirectly by sending the interesting and useful work outside of the organisation, stopping the development of skills and knowledge in-house. So about half of our recommendations apply to restoring the public service. That means ending the cap on public servants they can hire in-house, building an element of capacity building for the public service into any consultancy contract. So yes, you might go to the consultants this time, but they're meant to build up the public service so it can do the work itself next time. We also want to see what work is being farmed out to consultants. And that means we need to see the advice and reports that come back from consultants to know that they're actually giving good advice.
So does that not happen? Is the work that they're producing largely invisible? Is it secret?
It is largely secret. We don't know for all departments, but for the departments that we do have information on, about 80% of consultants' reports haven't been made public. We've seen that with a few high-profile cases. So the Australia Post report by Boston Consulting Group that led to such controversy a few years ago had to be dragged out through a parliamentary process. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known what they'd been doing.
And it looks like you've outsourced to Boston Consulting Group what you should do on JobSeeker. That's what it looks like. And unless you can produce the research report for me, that is what I'm left thinking. Maybe you won't be inundated so much with questions on notice and FOIs if you actually released information that the public deserves to have made public.
And they paid for.
Yeah, exactly. And they paid for.
And you've called for firms who breach the public trust, consulting firms, to be banned from receiving government contracts. Why is that?
That's right. It goes to a few different elements. The first is that we know that they can't be trusted. We saw not just one partner at PwC abuse this information. It got passed around to, as far as we know, 20 to 30 staff and partners. And as far as we know, none of them sounded the alarm. None of them gave any suggestion that they appreciated that this was wrong. We don't want that to happen again with other sensitive government information. But we've also seen consulting firms fail to meet their obligations to the public. And unfortunately, I'm going to rag on PwC again here. But they were asked to investigate the unlawful robo-debt scheme. And they found that it had deep flaws, but they buried the final report instead of submitting it to government. Now, that's a failure to understand that they're ultimately being paid by the Australian public, and that's where their duty lies, not to the government of the day.
And is that more clear-cut, I guess, if you're a public servant? You know that you're working for the Australian people, whereas if you're a consultant, I guess you're worried about that next government contract.
Exactly right. And we have systems in place. They're not perfect, but to hold public servants to account. We've got the Public Service Act, which requires them to, I'm paraphrasing here, but be frank and fearless, that old requirement. We have a freedom of information system that can dig into their correspondence, early drafts of documents, and actually find out where the pressure might have been applied to change things. And of course, it's Senate estimates. Senior public servants have to front up and answer questions of parliamentarians. All this is designed to emphasise to public servants that that's where their loyalties should lie, to the public.
And that they're accountable as well, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What was the original quote you provided to complete the full review to the shareholder ministers?
The quote was 1.38 million, I believe.
Were you aware at the time that your work would be kept secret, and away from the eyes of the Australian people?
We were aware that we were producing a product for government, and it was government's decision what it would do with the product.
But there's nothing the public should be afraid of the government, in your view, is there?
It's quite common for our work to be given to government and then for government to decide what it does with it.
Are you surprised they've kept it secret?
That's not an answer to my question.
So it's a betrayal of professional behaviours everywhere.
Bill, where do you think we're going from here? Is the scandal that's engulfed PwC really shone a spotlight on consulting firms and the overuse and over-reliance on them? How much of an appetite do you think there is for change?
I hope that there's a strong appetite. The Albanese government campaigned on reducing the amount of money that's spent on labour hire and consultancy. So we don't know exactly how many of the savings that they've identified will come out of this use of consultants versus other practices. But it's a promising sign that they're taking this seriously. And Labor senators have been, along with Green senators and members of the opposition, pursuing this issue with PwC. So there's an appetite for change there. But it's not progressing as quickly as I would have hoped. There's been some money set aside in the most recent budget to set up an in-house consulting service, so public servants acting as consultants for other government departments. But it's not a lot of money to replace $1 billion per year plus.
Presumably still much cheaper, though.
Definitely cheaper. If you think about the pressures and incentives that exist for consultants, they're very different to those that public servants face. Consultants are looking for the next contract from government, so they're likely to adjust their advice to reflect what they think the government might want to hear. But it's also the case that no client wants to be told, oh, you're doing great, change nothing, because they're going to question why they paid for that advice in the first place. So with any consultant, public or private, there's going to be a pressure to recommend changes even if none are needed. Consulting firms also have private clients with their own interests. And there's always going to be a danger that a consulting firm that's asked to advise the government ends up giving advice that favours their energy clients or their tax-paying clients as well. So there's real concerns there that aren't present when that work's given to a public servant who's actually going to have to be there to implement the changes that they recommend.
Yeah. All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Bill.
Great, thank you.
This episode was recorded live on Tuesday the 16th of May 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love Follow the Money and want to help us continue to do work with impact, please consider supporting us with a small tax-deductible gift today at australiainstitute.org.au. And that's also where you'll find our submission about consulting firms. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Bill Brown is at Brown with an E on the end, 90. And our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing from Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.